Hey everyone! Today's story is about a boy who gets exiled after everyone discovers he has a dark attribute. But that's not even the worst part. He learns he's destined to become the final hidden boss and bring ruin to everything around him. So this time he decides to destroy his own bad ending first. So with that said, let's begin the story. The ceremonial hall was enveloped in a solemn silence. On the dais stood a frail old man with a staff and a long beard, the holy man who was to preside over the ritual of judgment. Before him, kneeling on one knee, stood a young man in a rich cloak with light hair. When the old man loudly announced the start of the ritual, Schneizel paled slightly, pressed his hand to his chest, and nodded briefly, asking for the ceremony to begin. His father and brother stood at a distance with barely perceptible smirks, awaiting the result. The old man began the ritual, and suddenly turned pale himself. His lips struggled to utter a single word: darkness. A heavy darkness instantly enveloped the hall. And when it dissipated, the old man added that the young man's element was darkness, and nothing else. A wave of anxious whispering immediately swept through the hall. The guests were discussing how darkness had not made itself known for 30 years, and its very appearance here seemed a bad omen. The older brother, clad in armor, raised his eyebrows sharply and exclaimed that this could not be, for this attribute belonged only to the lineage of the evil god, and he did not understand how such a thing could have appeared in their noble house at all. Schneizel remained kneeling, motionless. He was simply stunned. The father rushed to the old man and, addressing him as His Holiness, demanded an explanation and asked if some mistake were possible. Could a bearer of darkness truly have appeared in the house of Arclight? The old man gripped his staff tighter, shook his head, and said with regret that there are no mistakes in the divine judgment. The older brother looked intently at his father. The latter slowly bowed his head, turning pale, and could not find a word in reply, only muttered something under his breath, as if trying to find at least some explanation for what was happening. Schneizel quietly lowered his gaze, and he thought that he had always known this was how it was meant to end. A short while later, he was sitting in his chambers, slumping heavily onto a small sofa. He exhaled loudly and folded his hands on his knees, staring at the floor. A maid immediately rushed over with a tray of tea and asked anxiously if something was wrong. After all, the young master didn't seem like himself at all today, and everything in the house felt somehow strange. Schneizel looked at her and tried to smile, quietly replying that everything had turned out pretty much as he'd expected, but that something had hit him harder than he'd care to admit. His gaze drifted to the window, and memories of the past began to surface. He remembered how, as a child, he studied hard and made plans. At a very young age, he built a cooling box. His father had clearly been proud of him back then, though he never missed an opportunity to use his ideas for his own purposes. He also remembered his older brother, how they used to run through the hallways together, and Schneizel would excitedly explain his latest idea. But his brother just looked on in surprise, not understanding. Back then, he was truly happy, and his family loved him. Schneizel quietly muttered, almost to himself, that he wasn't 8 years old anymore, and that this alone wouldn't break him. After those words, he fell silent and stared out the window again. The maid looked at him in confusion, not knowing what to say. Just then, his older brother appeared in the doorway. He shook his head in displeasure and curtly ordered Schneizel to follow him. Schneizel silently got up and went. A few minutes later, they found themselves in a small hall where their father was already waiting. The older brother immediately went over to him, leaving Schneizel alone in the middle of the room. Their father thrust his arm out sharply and grimly announced that Schneizel was banished. And then he asked how his son, the blood of a proud lineage, dared to let the magic of darkness into himself. Schneizel's eyes widened, and he stumbled. And he demanded an explanation, for he had worked with all his might for the sake of this house, and they knew that perfectly well. Then his older brother spoke up. That was exactly what had always seemed suspicious to him. All that unnatural power, those ideas far too wild for anyone in the family to have ever had. And now darkness as well. He no longer had any doubts. Schneizel had been a minion of the evil god from the very beginning, nothing but a monster. Schneizel took a step toward him and reached out his hand. The next moment, the older brother flung him against the wall with a sharp movement. The back of his head slammed into the stone with a dull thud, and Schneizel slid down, clenching his teeth and closing his eyes against the pain. His father and brother moved closer. His father raised an eyebrow, snorted, and asked with feigned indifference if he was out cold yet. Then he ordered them to take him away. His older brother nodded and reached out to him, but the next second, he was struck on the arm, and, taken by surprise, he took a few steps back. Schneizel was getting up from the floor. A dark shadow was slowly spreading around him, thick and dense, as if alive. He snorted and realized that if he just stood there watching in silence, everything would indeed end exactly like this. He stood up. One eye was obscured by a black spot, his face unnaturally contorted. He almost looked insane. and he calmly announced that he would leave on his own now. His relatives stood silently, watching him with fear. Schneizel thrust his arm forward and harshly reminded them that he had given a great deal to this house, and they were kicking him out for it, not giving a damn about anything. No one answered. The elders merely took a silent step back. Schneizel narrowed his eyes and demanded an answer. Then the older brother shouted, shielding their father with his body, that this was the very pressure he had always suspected, the power of an evil god, and therefore the younger brother had been deceiving them since childhood. Schneizel said nothing and watched in silence, until their father, catching his breath slightly, repeated the verdict. Schneizel is banished to Helena's domain, to that cursed land. Schneizel gave a slight shake of his head, brushing the hair from his forehead, and calmly asked, Helena's domain, isn't that the very cursed land where, according to rumors, an evil god once took up residence? His father coldly retorted that if his son did not leave of his own accord, other methods would be found. Then he turned slightly and ordered that this abomination be thrown out. Heavy, measured footsteps sounded from behind one of the columns. Schneizel looked up. Standing before him was a massive warrior in knight's armor, wearing a helmet resembling that of a crusader. He approached silently and unhurriedly. Schneizel snorted and asked who it was. His older brother had already opened his mouth, but Schneizel, without looking at him, folded his arms across his chest, turned slightly away, and casually said himself, could this really be the Holy Knight? And is he truly that strong? His older brother shouted something incoherent in a panic, stumbling over his words. Schneizel didn't even glance at him. He looked off to the side, frowning slightly, and he murmured, isn't this guy the very strongest hidden boss? Then he turned to his brother, and there was such calm superiority in his gaze that words were almost unnecessary. He simply noted that such an opponent was no obstacle to him. After that, he stared off into the distance again and muttered through clenched teeth, who even comes up with characters like this? He raised his hand high, pulled off his glove in one swift motion, and commanded the shadows to become his hands and feet. Dark flashes immediately ran across his skin and surged forward. The shadows glided across the stone floor with swift tentacles, wrapped themselves around the huge knight from bottom to top, and lifted him into the air. Schneizel stood below, watching this with utter indifference. Then the shadows released their grip. The knight crashed onto the stone floor with a deafening thud and did not move again. Schneizel's father and older brother silently backed away, their eyes fixed on the motionless body. His older brother stumbled, grabbed the wall, and began muttering in panic. So this is what it is, the magic of darkness. Schneizel noticed this hesitation. He lowered his palm and moved his fingers slightly. The shadows on his hand obediently rippled and flowed out across the floor in dark waves, sliding and spreading to every corner of the hall, reaching every crack in the stone. Schneizel bowed his head and calmly declared that whether he was a holy knight or anyone else, he was the strongest here and no one else. A short while later, Schneizel walked down the long corridor of the mansion, and he spoke to the emptiness around him. With a hint of displeasure on his face, he muttered that he would have won even without outside knowledge of the game. But so be it. He would say thank you. Just then, his personal maid came running around the corner and called out to the young master in alarm. Schneizel stopped and raised an eyebrow. He calmly remarked that he hadn't killed his father, his brother, or anyone else, so she should calm down. The maid shook her head quickly and replied that that wasn't what she was talking about. She stumbled, her eyes widening, and asked excitedly, Is he really her young master? Schneizel stared at her in surprise. Then he shrugged, closed his eyes, and said that who knows, maybe he had simply revealed his true nature by awakening the magic of darkness. The maid bowed her head slightly, bit her lip, and remained silent. They stood in silence for a few seconds, with only the crackling of a torch fire somewhere in the distance. Then the girl looked up and asked what he intended to do now. Schneizel replied that he was going to Helena's domain. Noticing the unspoken question in the maid's eyes, he looked at his hand. The shadows were still trembling slightly at his fingertips, and explained with a hint of annoyance that he wanted to find out why the dark attribute was so hated in this world, even if it meant tracking down the evil god himself and questioning him personally. Then he tapped his forehead and added that he was doing all this partly because a certain guy he was talking to hadn't bothered to explain anything properly. The maid cautiously asked which guy he was talking about. Schneizel snorted and gave a brief nod, saying it was none of her business. The girl folded her arms in front of her, looking slightly embarrassed. Then she jerked her head up, her eyes flashing, and said firmly that in that case she wanted to show him something, and immediately corrected herself. Young master, no, now a Master Schneizel. They descended the spiral staircase for a long time. Schneizel looked around in bewilderment. The maid approached one of the cages and raised the lantern higher, peering inside anxiously. Uneven light fell on a girl of about 10 to 13. She sat chained to a massive boulder by the wall. She watched the newcomers warily and silently. Schneasel stopped beside her and whispered that the girl before him was a dark elf. A voice in his head confirmed. If he was not mistaken, elves of this kind were called minions of the evil god in this world. The maid, not having heard this remark, said softly that the girl had been brought to the mansion a few days ago, and it seemed they were going to sell her into slavery, and the thought of it was unbearable. Schneasel frowned and quietly remarked that if word got out, who knows what they would do to the maid herself. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and she took a deep breath, pressed her palm to her chest, and said that it was he who had once taught her how important it was to help people in trouble. She acts this way so that she won't be ashamed to call herself Lord Schneasel's personal maid. The protagonist listened to this impassioned speech with undisguised surprise. Then he snorted and tilted his head back. He muttered into the void that it seemed his 8 years hadn't been wasted after all. The maid looked at him in surprise. She asked anxiously, "Who is he talking to right now?" The elf in the cage had been watching the scene intently the whole time. She didn't move or make a sound, but her eyes suddenly widened. She saw something the others hadn't. Hovering right in the air above Schneasel's head was a dark-haired man. Schneasel clearly saw him and looked at him with his usual displeasure. The maid stood nearby, shifting her gaze in confusion from her master to the empty space in front of him. She didn't understand what was happening. The ghost glided forward a few meters and hovered directly in front of Schneasel, looking at him questioningly. Schneasel frowned and dryly remarked that this guy had promised to help avoid the flags of doom, and immediately followed up by asking if all this was somehow connected to why dark attributed and half-breeds were so oppressed in this world. White flashes flickered erratically around the ghost, casting faint glints on the stone walls of the dungeon. Schneasel crossed his arms over his chest and firmly ordered him to tell everything he knew. The man in front of him cleared his throat, nodded, and said quietly that he understood, and he would tell everything he knew about this world. Japan. It was already 11 o'clock at night. There was almost no one left in the office of a high-rise building in Tokyo. Just a couple of employees who hadn't dared to leave early. One of them, Sanada, sat at his desk in a light-colored turtleneck, a name tag on his chest, his dark hair tousled. He was clearly exhausted. His back was hunched, his gaze barely focused on the screen. Finally, he turned off the monitor, exhaled heavily, and muttered to himself that just a little longer, and he'd be able to go home. He'd been working on the same project for 4 days now, barely leaving the office, and his fatigue was mounting with every passing hour. Just then his boss, Ogata, approached him. A satisfied smirk, his eyebrows slightly raised. He called out to Sanada and held out a folder of papers, casually explaining that the data for this character also needed to be finished by tomorrow morning. Sanada glanced at the sheets in surprise. There was a sketch of one of the game's heroes. Leaning back slightly in his chair, he tensely pointed out that this was, after all, Ogata's area of responsibility. The boss turned around, gave him a quick glance, and with a smirk told him not to get in his way, because unlike some people, he was busy with a pile of far more important tasks. And it was precisely thanks to him that the game would become more interesting. So his subordinate had better keep quiet. Sanada clenched the papers in his hands tighter, but just sighed quietly and said nothing. When the boss left, one of Sanada's colleagues approached him, a girl who had also stayed late. She muttered quietly that their boss was simply unbearable and always dumped everything on Sanada alone. Then she hesitated slightly, folded her arms in front of her, and offered to take on the work herself. Sanada looked at her in surprise and immediately gave an awkward smile, saying that everything was fine. After all, she'd just gotten married, so why would she want to stay late? And he had nothing to do at home anyway, so she should just leave it to him. The girl called out his name anxiously, clearly worried. However, Sanada wasn't listening anymore. He was trying to pretend everything was fine and began shuffling through the papers, muttering that he'd sort out quickly. Suddenly, Sanada's vision went dark. His head spun, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed from his chair. Sanada remained lying there, motionless. His colleagues immediately rushed to him, calling out his name in unison. Someone was already calling an ambulance. As Sanada's consciousness faded, voices continued to sound, vague, distant, calling his name and asking if he was all right. Then even those began to fade, dissolving into the darkness. Then the voices began to change. They were still calling him, but differently now. Young Master Schneasel. Sanada slowly opened his eyes. His hair fell over his face. He brushed it aside with his hand and saw a dark-haired girl standing before him. She held a tray of tea anxiously and asked quietly if everything was all right with the young master. Sanada sat up in bed. He found himself in a child's body and muttered, bewildered, that he was fine. Then he began to look around quickly. A spacious room, high ceilings, heavy curtains, Western-style furniture. It was a mansion. An unfamiliar one. The maid approached, exhaling with relief, and said that the young master hadn't regained consciousness at all, and she had been very worried. Sanada looked at the girl in front of him, feeling embarrassed, and he asked uncertainly, "A maid?" She immediately leaned toward him with concern and called him by name, Schneizel. Hearing that name, the boy flinched. He opened his mouth. He slowly looked at his hands, small, childlike, and in the next second jumped out of bed. He rushed to the mirror. An unfamiliar face stared back at him from the mirror. The very character he and his team had been brainstorming for months. The maid ran after him, calling his name. Sanada turned around with difficulty, forced a semblance of a reassuring smile, apologized, said he needed to think things over, and asked to be left alone for a little while. The girl nodded and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Sanada turned back to the mirror and placed his hand on its cold, smooth surface. He frowned in concern as he looked at his reflection and began to slowly piece together in his mind what was actually happening. Could this really be a dream? A little later, when he had regained his composure somewhat, he began to wander around the estate. Sanada walked slowly, looking around, and he thought that since it was Schneizel's face, this must be the game world. Suddenly, a silhouette flashed ahead. He approached and recognized the older brother of the boy whose body he had inhabited. Sanada called out his name and stepped forward, holding out his hand. The older brother jerked his hand away, shouting that he had no intention of talking to that damn bastard, and he walked away without looking back. Sanada remained standing in the middle of the hallway in complete silence. A little while later, he went out into the garden and settled into one of the gazebos. He looked at his small, childish hands and wondered what that nickname meant. Curse spawn? He snorted to himself, and he wondered what Schneizel's past, the one they concocted together with the team, had actually been like. A different kind of power holder, born into the royal family. But what came before that? What happened in his very childhood, before all the rest? He was snapped out of his thoughts by a loud male shout. Someone was demanding an explanation from the maid. Sanada jumped to his feet and peered out from behind a bush. Standing before the dark-haired girl, the very one who had been with him just a short while ago, was an elderly man, furiously demanding to know how she dared to pick flowers without permission, flowers so precious to this estate. The girl shyly folded her hands in front of her and quietly asked for forgiveness. She had only wanted to brighten up the young master's room a little, since he lived such a lonely life. The elderly man twitched his mustache, furrowed his brow, and shouted that he didn't care about such things, and that it was enough to give the boy the bare minimum of food, and nothing more. Sanada crouched slightly behind a bush so he wouldn't be noticed, and slowly pieced it all together. This elderly man, it seemed, was the head of the estate, and therefore Schneizel's father. The maid, still holding the bouquet of flowers, widened her eyes and tried to protest. The next second, a blow struck the maid's face, and she screamed loudly. The flowers scattered across the grass, and she fell to the ground. Sanada jumped to his feet and peered out from behind a bush, unable to believe his eyes. Meanwhile, his father stretched out his hand and continued shouting, asking how some servant dared to contradict him. And then a boy ran forward. He called out loudly to those present, drawing their attention. The adults turned around and froze, because what was happening around the child defied all explanation. Schneizel's shadow on the ground began to grow. One of Schneizel's eyes darkened. The boy stared intently at his father. His father turned to him and demanded an explanation in an irritated tone. What on earth was going on? And what was this kid doing here? Schneizel frowned and shouted furiously, demanding that the man apologize for what he had done to that girl. His father shouted back and asked how he dared, and then he stopped short. Something invisible squeezed his chest. In the next second, the shadows burst from their places. They surged in from all sides at once, and standing right in the center of it all was no longer a child. It was a shadow in the shape of a child. The father was gasping for breath. Something invisible was squeezing him tighter and tighter. He clenched his teeth and remained silent, unwilling to give in, even though he could barely breathe. The maid struggled to her feet. She looked around, and without a moment's hesitation, she rushed forward, straight into the center of the darkness. She darted between the boy and the father, spread her arms wide, and shouted the young master's name with all her might. The shadows began to recede. The father was finally able to breathe. He clenched his hands into fists, but didn't move, regaining his composure. Gradually, Schneizel began to return to his normal appearance. The maid ran up to him and reached out her hands. The boy said nothing and remained silent, staring at where his father had been standing. When he finally came to his senses, he spun around abruptly and shouted that it would have been better if his younger son had never been born. After all, it was because of him that his wife had died back then. The maid hugged the boy tightly, trying to shield him from those words, pressing his head against her. But Schneizel heard all. He frowned and silently watched his father walk away, without looking back, until his figure finally disappeared around the corner. When Sanada returned to the room, he lay down on the bed, threw his arms behind his head, and stared at the ceiling. The boy's mother had died in childbirth. That was why his father hated him. That was why the whole household had turned its back on him. Although he didn't remember any such settings in the game at all, he tried to focus, but his thoughts kept returning to that moment in the garden, to the rage that had washed over him like a dark wave. Sanada clutched the sheet tighter and closed his eyes, trying to quell the unpleasant sensation in his chest. And then it dawned on him. The evil god, something like the hidden puppeteer of this game world. In the game, Schneizel eventually falls under his power and is killed. That is his role, a hidden boss who was destroyed in the finale, which meant this body was bound to die according to the plot. Sanada sat up abruptly in bed. He thought gloomily that he hadn't been completely taken over yet, but then he wondered, was the evil god already closing in on him? Then he muttered aloud that he was in deep trouble, after all, with a whole bunch of death flags already in place. And he had to do something urgently to avoid dying in the body of this hidden boss. From somewhere off to the side, a boyish voice called out to him and asked, "What are these flags of doom?" Sanada's eyes widened in surprise. He began looking around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then he looked up and saw the soul of the boy whose body he was currently inhabiting. Sanada stared blankly at the ghost in front of him and shouted that it was Schneizel. The boy immediately shouted back that it was indeed him and demanded his body back. Sanada froze in confusion, took a step back, and mumbled an apology, saying that he would gladly fix everything himself, but he simply didn't understand how this had happened. Schneizel's spirit muttered something in reply, and then the boy asked furiously, "Who the hell was this guy anyway?" Sanada lowered his head and scratched the back of his neck slightly, and began to explain that he was one of the creators of this world. The boy furrowed his brow in confusion and asked in bewilderment, did he mean to say he was a god? Sanada just shrugged and spread his hands, not knowing what to say out loud. Schneizel stared at him for a moment, then started laughing. Then he shouted, "No way! Some madman has taken over his body." Sanada took a few steps forward, calmly folded his hands on his belt, shook his head, and replied that no, he wasn't a madman. The boy instantly stopped laughing, raised his eyebrows in surprise, and asked what exactly he meant. Sanada looked extremely serious as he explained that this world was inside the game. Schneizel froze in shock. He slowly looked at his hands, then looked up at his companion again, and, stumbling over his words, asked again. Sanada stepped closer, looking very tired, and said that he knew what future awaited Schneizel. The boy will succumb to the evil god, and then appear as the strongest and worst hidden boss, and kill the saint. And then the boy himself understands. A group of heroes will come to take revenge. And if everything goes exactly that way, Schneizel has no future other than death. The boy frowned, bowed his head, and muttered that, just as he'd thought, the man in front of him was simply some kind of madman. However, Sanada, ignoring these words, continued, Schneizel must feel it himself, the sensation as if someone else is trying to take over his body. That is the power of the evil god. After these words, the boy fell silent and froze, trying to make sense of what he had heard. Then he thrust his arm forward decisively, pointed his finger at Sanada, and asked why it was him, of all people, sitting in his body. Sanada shrugged and replied without any solemnity that he didn't know the answer to that. Schneizel responded with a loud outburst of indignation. But Sanada continued, be that as it may, if things continued on their current course, he would die along with him. So he would do whatever it took to avoid the outcome where Schneizel would be swallowed by darkness and killed. And then he asked if the boy had any objections. Schneizel frowned, clearly holding back a flood of emotions, and then dryly remarked that he didn't really care. He couldn't do anything anyway until he got his body back. So let Sanada do whatever he wants. Although the thought of some stranger sitting in his body didn't make him happy at all. 8 years had passed since then. The story returned to the present. Schneizel, now an adult, stood there, and he looked at Sanada, with whom he had spent all these years. Sanada closed his eyes and quietly, somewhat uncertainly, apologized for everything. Schneizel furrowed his brow and paused for a second. Then he muttered that something didn't add up. Sanada raised his eyebrows in surprise and waited for him to continue. Schneizel continued, let's say this world really is a game, as Sanada always says. But do those who created it really think it's normal to enslave innocent women? Sanada frowned and tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. In his mind, he looked at the now grown boy with whom he had spent 8 years, and thought that Schneizel was still very young. Even in his own world, in his native Japan, this was the most common of tragedies. He said aloud that the innocent and the weak are always oppressed by someone. After these words, the elven girl in the cage slowly stood up and approached the bars. Sanada, meanwhile, added that the workings of this world seemed to differ greatly from what he himself had originally intended. Schneizel frowned slightly and remarked that it appeared even the so-called creator of the game didn't know everything that was happening here. Wasn't that so? Schneizel frowned even more deeply and snapped that this guy called himself a creator but was completely useless, and called Sanada an old man. Sanada immediately shouted back, telling the guy to shut up. Schneizel frowned even more and muttered quietly that if that was indeed the case, then he already knew what he had to do. Just then, a maid interrupted the conversation. She hesitantly addressed the young master and cautiously asked, "Who are you talking to?" Instead of answering, Schneizel silently waved his hand. In the next second, the dungeon bars simply crumbled into pieces. Then the chain holding the elf girl in place, chaining her to a massive boulder, snapped. Schneizel stepped forward and scooped the girl up into his arms. Sanada immediately swam up to him and asked what he intended to do now. The young man replied that he was going to meet the one they call the evil god and find out the truth for himself. Then he looked at his companion and added that he intended to uncover the workings of this world. Sanada stared at him, almost in shock. The elven girl cautiously peeked out from behind Schneizel's elbow and looked into the face of her unexpected savior. Suddenly, Schneizel turned to her and briefly ordered her to take him to where the evil god dwells. Sanada immediately snapped and shouted, "To the evil god? Was he an idiot?" Going there was tantamount to walking straight into his own doom. Schneizel grimly declared that he would no longer walk into the darkness. Sanada slumped his shoulders and began muttering something in frustration. Schneizel turned to him with obvious irritation on his face and snapped that Sanada should at least trust him a little. Schneizel turned slightly and looked at the maid and muttered aloud that all this time he had thought he was alone, but it seemed he had been mistaken. He recalled how this very girl, despite his father's prohibitions, had always stayed by his side and comforted him during the hardest moments. The maid's eyes widened in surprise, and she whispered his name. Then Sanada realized that yes, even that hated father and brother had, at some point, begun to trust him as well. So his efforts hadn't been in vain either. Upon hearing this, Schneizel nodded and told his companion that he had indeed been helpful. The maid, hearing this strange one-sided conversation, flushed in confusion, then looked at the young master in surprise. She bowed deeply and quietly asked him to take care of himself. Schneizel took the elf more firmly by the arm and moved toward the exit, briefly waving to the maid in farewell. A short while later, they were riding through a dense forest along a narrow path. The girl inside the carriage immediately huddled in the far corner. Schneizel sat across from her, folded his arms across his chest, and looked around tensely. Sanada slumped in his seat and looked completely calm, as if what was happening had nothing to do with him. The elf peered warily from under the hood of her cloak and stared intently at both men, trying to figure out what was going on and what they wanted from her. Meanwhile, Sanada looked out the window at the receding estate and remained tense and silent. Then Schneizel smirked and remarked that Sanada seemed genuinely sad and asked if it was because of the maid. He then added that Sanada should have stayed at the estate. Sanada vehemently objected, muttering, "How could I possibly have stayed there?" And then, with undisguised irritation, he admitted that he really did like the maid very much. Schneizel snorted, twisted his lips into a smirk, and declared that he was simply looking at a lecherous middle-aged man. The elf girl, listening to the adult's argument, huddled even tighter in the corner, pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and was clearly trying to blend into the seat upholstery, just so they wouldn't notice her and drag her into this strange conversation. Meanwhile, the men continued to argue. Sanada, defending himself, declared that such a sheltered young man, knowing nothing of the world, was by default doomed to remain a grown child at home. Schneizel rolled his eyes in response, shrugged, and said he had no idea what his interlocutor had just said, but he felt insulted, and ordered the man to get out of the carriage. He waved his hand, trying to push the ghost away, but his hand simply passed right through him, without touching a single thing. Schneizel snorted and mused aloud that, just as he'd thought, physical intervention wouldn't be possible in this state. He'd tested it himself back when they'd first switched. Sanada was always inside the boy's body, while Schneizel's spirit remained somewhere nearby, invisible to others. And even when he himself took control of the body, Sanada didn't disappear anywhere. He just watched. Sanada sighed heavily and shrugged, confirming this. But he said he would definitely help unravel the mysteries of this world. He then casually added that, in his current state, he couldn't stray far from the body, so one way or another they'd have to stay together all the time. Besides, his knowledge would surely come in handy. Schneizel snorted in response, and with deliberate disdain, he remarked that he was quite capable of uncovering all the secrets without the help of some lecherous middle-aged man. Sanada muttered discontentedly that he could at least have come up with a different nickname. Schneizel shrugged and, suggested Sanada, immediately shook his head and decided that the previous option was better after all. Schneizel exhaled heavily and folded his arms across his chest. Then he turned to the girl and asked her name. The elf girl pulled back the hood of her tattered cloak, furrowed her brow slightly and quietly said, "Laranoa." Sanada repeated her name to himself, and a look of recognition flashed in his eyes. He was clearly thinking about something. But his train of thought was cut short by a sudden jolt. The carriage jerked and came to a screeching halt. Everyone jumped up at once and stared out the window. Schneasel immediately flung open the door and leaned out almost halfway, sharply asking the coachman what was going on and why had he stopped. He looked around and slowly frowned, involuntarily leaning back. Across the narrow forest road stood a small detachment of armed soldiers in heavy armor and dark cloaks. Schneasel stepped down from the carriage onto the ground. Laranoa followed, and Sanada behind her. All three froze, trying to assess the situation. Voices began to rise from the ranks of the soldiers. They demanded that Schneasel, a sinner and minion of an evil god, kneel and accept his doom. Schneasel furrowed his brow sharply and furiously called out to Sanada by his favorite nickname, "Lecherous Man," and demanded an explanation. Sanada immediately flew closer, and he shouted that these were the Knights of Execution. Their squad knew no mercy when it came to heresy and ungodly cults. Upon hearing this, Schneasel muttered through clenched teeth that his father, so, from the very beginning, had no intention of letting him live. He didn't have time to finish. The knight, clearly the squad's leader, stepped forward, silently gripping his weapon tighter, and he brought down a heavy blow where Schneasel had been standing just a second ago. At the last moment, Schneasel managed to step back, shielding Laranoa and Sanada with his body in a single motion. Then he straightened up, running his fingers over his cheek. There was a thin, red wound from sharp shard. Schneasel brushed away the blood, snorted, and said with a cold smirk that this was perfect. The next second, he summoned dark magic. Laranoa rubbed her chin, looking somewhat bewildered, and then, noticing the magic before her, she lifted the corner of her lips slightly and looked at the boy with undisguised curiosity. Meanwhile, somewhere on the other side of the world, a bell rang out. In a large, majestic temple, in one of the spacious halls with high stone vaults, stood a young girl. She folded her hands in front of her in a prayerful gesture and offered a prayer to the gods. Suddenly, 3 people in cloaks appeared behind her. They turned to the saint and asked if anything had happened. The girl paused for a second. Then, with a slight smile, she turned to her followers and said that she had suddenly been overcome by a strange feeling. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, events were unfolding rapidly. Schneasel summoned the shadows, and they gathered around him in dense clusters and took shape. Dozens of birds burst into the air from the pure darkness, and they flew over the clearing. He glanced to the side, and he noticed a small red stone on Laranoa's chest. Meanwhile, the knights had started moving again. They advanced slowly and in unison, repeating the same thing in unison, like a single mechanism, to purge the minion of the evil god. Schneasel muttered that they were creepy guys. Sanada grimly agreed. It was impossible to reason with them. They were under a spell. Without turning around, Schneasel snapped that Sanada shouldn't even think about spouting his usual nonsense about not wanting to kill people. Sanada shrugged and replied that it seemed they had no choice anyway. No matter how much his Japanese principles resisted it, they'd simply be killed here otherwise, and the girl would most likely be left alive and turned into a magical catalyst. With that, he glanced at Laranoa, making sure she could actually hear what was going on. Schneasel snorted, looking completely confident, summoned a few more shadows, and calmly declared that he would now show everyone present who the real prize was here. The knights continued to advance, monotonously repeating their mantra, and Schneasel suddenly snapped that he was tired of hearing this. He waved his hand sharply, and a thick, dark dome instantly closed over all 3 of them. Then Schneasel stepped forward, gave a grim smile, and quietly remarked that these knights were just as likely to end up in the dock themselves. The next second, he literally exploded with darkness. The front ranks of knights vanished in the blink of an eye. Their armor offered no protection. The darkness penetrated the metal without encountering any resistance. Screams tore through the forest silence. The remaining knights, however, continued to move, monotonously, mechanically, as if wound up. The minion of the evil god must be purged. Several of them changed direction and moved toward Laranoa, who found herself right in the center of the chaos. Sanada shouted that this was bad if they took the girl hostage. Schneasel glanced at him with a smirk and said he was a fool, and asked if he really thought some hostages would have any effect on him. 5 knights tightly surrounded Laranoa and continued to close in. Sanada was already shouting. Was Schneasel really not going to save her? Was he just going to abandon her? This was a mockery. Schneasel shrugged slightly and calmly replied that there was no need for that. The next second, the red crystal on Laranoa's chest flared up, brightly, almost blindingly, and then it burst. Fire surged outward in a broad wave, instantly engulfing all 5 soldiers at once. The screams lasted a few seconds, then died down. Sanada watched in bewilderment as the fire died down and the smoke dissipated. Schneizel looked at the girl with undisguised satisfaction. And then, with a slight smile, he remarked that it seemed there was quite a bit of magical power in the crystal after all. Sanada stared intently at the girl, who remained completely unharmed after everything that had happened. His gaze lingered on the red stone on her chest. It was still glowing faintly, gradually fading. Sanada explained, "Dark elves have a magical stone in their chest that holds their power. The one with the strongest stone becomes the queen. So this girl, apparently, is the queen of the dark elves." Sanada flew closer to Schneizel and muttered under his breath that, according to the settings he and his team had programmed into the game, a powerful restraining seal should have been placed on the girl. Schneizel shrugged and casually mentioned that he had already removed it. Sanada spun around abruptly and demanded furiously, "Why did you do that?" Schneizel shrugged again and said that he thought it would be rather interesting. Ignoring the men's argument, the girl floated smoothly into the air. She spread her arms wide, made a few fluid movements, and began to cast a spell. Behind her, a huge tree began to sprout from the ground with a deafening crash. The world tree was unfolding to its full power, and the first thing it did was strike the remaining soldiers. Sanada muttered that it was truly impressive. Schneizel, standing nearby, grunted and said she was good at this. Larinoa hovered in the air, clenching her fists, and with a barely perceptible movement of her hand, she directed the branches toward the men themselves. Sanada lunged forward, shielding his comrade with his body, and shouted that they were definitely not enemies. Schneizel, without saying a word, waved his hand, and instantly, a dome of pure darkness appeared in the air. The branches of the world tree struck it with all their might and bounced off. The dome didn't even flinch. Then Sanada spoke up again and shouted at his subordinate to stop and give him a chance to convince the girl that they were allies. Larinoa landed on the ground with a huff, flung her arm to the side. The tree froze, and its branches slowly dropped. She took a few steps forward and stopped right in front of Schneizel. She looked into his eyes for a long time. Then she asked, slightly uncertainly, could he really be the Lord of Order from the prophecy? A little while later, when everything had calmed down, they settled down amid the debris of the battle. Larinoa sat on a fallen tree trunk, and the men sat across from her on a rock. All three were silent. The girl was gathering her thoughts. The men were waiting. Finally, she folded her hands in front of her and spoke. She told them that the prophecy had said that in the hour of need, their people would be saved by a bearer of dark magic. Now Helena's lands were on the brink of destruction at the hands of a certain creature who called himself the Creator. It was he who had kidnapped her and imprisoned her in that mansion. Sanada flinched slightly, frowned in displeasure, and wondered which creator she was talking about. There was nothing like that in the game at all. Schneizel smirked beside him and remarked with undisguised mockery that Sanada was a man who had nothing but knowledge. He called him a useless old man who, by all accounts, didn't really know how to work. Sanada rolled his eyes and muttered that the guy had a sharp tongue. Schneizel didn't reply and looked at the girl again, then asked who this so-called creator was. Larinoa lowered her gaze and quietly said that they didn't know themselves. Then she raised her voice and said that this creator had appeared out of nowhere and was talking about some kind of data. He'd also brought monsters with him that no one had ever seen before. Sanada crossed his arms over his chest and asked thoughtfully. Suddenly, Larinoa jumped to her feet. She took a few quick steps forward, and resolutely, with a frown, she declared that if Schneizel was truly the savior of the prophecy, she wanted to ask permission to test his strength. The men exchanged glances with undisguised bewilderment. Meanwhile, the crystal on the girl's chest began to glow. Sanada immediately grew alarmed, held his hands out in front of him, and began shouting, "How on earth did things come to this?" Schneizel, however, shook his hair slightly, frowned a little, and laughed. Then he muttered that it sounded interesting. Sanada immediately turned his attention to him and shouted, "Why did you light up like that, too? Is that how things work in this world? Every problem is solved by force?" Larinoa didn't wait for an answer. She rose smoothly into the air, already beginning to cast a spell. Schneizel stepped forward and began summoning shadows. Then he grinned even wider and declared that now the Queen of the Dark Elves needed to show him her true power. The next moment, the Queen of the Dark Elves was already lying on the ground. She flew her eyes open in fury and stared ahead with the expression of someone who couldn't believe what had just happened. Schneizel stood casually right in front of her, waved his hand slightly to dispel the remaining shadows, and muttered with a displeased look that they'd said Queen, but this was what actually happened. Sanada flew over to his charge and examined him disapprovingly, then cast a glance at the devastated clearing. Then the two of them approached the girl. Sanada loomed behind Schneizel and was already shouting that it was too ruthless to fight a little girl with full force, and then began anxiously asking if she was all right. Schneasel, paying him no mind, bent down, grabbed Larinoa by the leg, and lifted her into the air, upside down. And with a displeased, narrowed gaze, he declared, why on earth would he kill her? After all, she still had to serve as a guide. Sanada immediately started screaming, because she was just a little girl. He could have been at least a little more careful. And he asked if he was mentally stable. Schneasel frowned in annoyance, rolled his eyes, and told his ally to shut up, since he couldn't hear a thing. Then he looked around tensely and added that if their pursuers showed up again, it would be a real hassle. After that, he addressed Larinoa in a commanding tone and ordered him to tell him where the nearest village was. After a while, they had already settled into one of the inns. The room on the second floor was small. Larinoa folded her hands in her lap, paused for a moment, and then said that she understood the Savior's power. Then, without taking her eyes off the men, she asked if they would agree to fight alongside the Demi-Humans Alliance. The men exchanged glances. Schneasel raised an eyebrow in surprise and asked for clarification. Sanada nodded and, settling more comfortably on the bed, explained that this was an alliance of dark elves, lizard men, and other races. In his game, they had been the minions of the evil god, those who were supposed to lead Schneasel into the world of evil. But mentally, he immediately added that this was in the game he had created. At that moment, the young queen interrupted his explanation. She clenched her fists on her lap and declared emphatically that the so-called evil god was not the one leading the world toward evil. Sanada threw his hands out to the sides and retorted that she thought that way because she was on his side, and suddenly he fell silent mid-sentence. Then he raised his eyebrows in surprise, and the next second he started shouting, clearly shaken by something. Schneasel turned to him, raised an eyebrow, and asked calmly, what's wrong? Larinoa, standing behind him, raised her eyebrows in surprise, folded her arms anxiously, and asked, is something happening? Sanada slowly swam closer to the girl and asked with undisguised uncertainty, does she really see him? Larinoa raised her eyebrows and calmly, though with a hint of confusion, replied, yes. Looked at both of them in turn and remarked with undisguised interest that this was quite unexpected. Then, speaking louder, added, so it turns out this elf girl can see the old man standing behind him? Sanada immediately boiled over with rage and shouted that his ward was speaking very unkindly of him. Larinoa paid no attention to their argument and calmly added that she couldn't see very clearly, but yes, and she could hear his voice too. Sanada frowned and lowered his head. He muttered that he understood, but to himself, he thought that the elves in his game had always been able to communicate with spirits, and if this girl was also the queen of the dark elves, then it was no surprise that she could see him in this state. Meanwhile, Larinoa clenched the fabric on her lap tightly and said that, of course, she wasn't asking for help for free. That is, if he agreed to lend them his power. The next second, the dark elf shed her torn dress. She covered her chest with her hand and rose from the bed, lowering her head. In a quiet, strained voice, the elf said that her master could do with her as he pleased. Sanada immediately jumped up from the bed and shouted her name, trying to shield her with his body. Schneasel lowered his hands from her chest and glanced briefly at the girl. Then, exhaling heavily, he closed his eyes, frowned in displeasure, and said coldly, almost indifferently, that her naked body didn't interest him at all. But her attitude was to his liking, so he would listen to her. The next second, Schneasel tossed her a white blanket and ordered her to get dressed. Meanwhile, somewhere on the other side of the country, in a large mansion, the atmosphere was completely different. In the spacious bedroom, with high ceilings and heavy drapes, the air wasn't just stuffy, it was oppressive. It smelled of sweat and cloying incense. On the enormous bed, buried in black silk sheets and surrounded by 4 naked girls, sat a man. A girl dressed as a nun, with an embroidered cross on her chest, whispered languidly and obsequiously, addressing him as her master and creator, about how she would give him her body, her heart, and her faith. Next to her, a girl with demonic horns blushed and whispered in a trembling, choked voice that she would make her master even happier. The man between them snorted, grinning. He embraced all 4 of them at once. Then he raised his head and laughed, and he shouted that it was unbearably good, then added that he couldn't get enough of it all. This was what he understood, a true otherworld. However, in his mind, he had already drifted off to another, the queen of the dark elves. She too would become his slave. It was Ogata, Sanada's former boss from another world. He shifted his gaze to the slave nun. She was writhing in his arms, unable to utter a single word. Ogata took out his phone and said, drawing out his words, that since she was saying such beautiful things, he would make it even more pleasurable for her. His fingers slid across the device. The next second, he turned her pleasure up to the max. The girl's whole body shook violently. Suddenly, the door to the room flew open. One of the servants entered with quick steps. He shouted loudly that something terrible had happened. It seems Schneasel has kidnapped the elven queen and fled. And now, by all accounts, he was heading toward the village of the evil god. Ogata raised his eyebrows in surprise. Then he turned to the servant and asked in a low, thick voice, "How could this have happened?" He glanced sideways at the wall, at the shadows cast by the candles. The evil god. So he did seduce him after all, and he became a hidden boss. Too soon. Much earlier than planned. Ogata frowned even more deeply, and he wondered, could this really be because of his presence? Mentally, he shook his head, dismissing his own thoughts. No, it couldn't be. But still, it was too soon. Maybe something was happening that he hadn't anticipated? Some twist he'd missed? What on earth could be going on? What if there was another reincarnated being? Besides himself? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Ogata clenched his jaw. For starters, he should increase the number of figures he could use. He had his eye on the Saint and the Saint Swordsman, and he wondered who he should play with first. A little while later, the three of them were sitting in a cart, heading somewhere. The elven girl settled on one side of the bench, the men on the other. Larinoa said that if the savior had truly come to them, then there was no need to worry anymore. Sonata frowned slightly and turned to the young man, warning him not to be so quick to trust the demi-humans alliance. According to the story, he explained, demi-humans are cruel and spare not even women and children. However, he hesitantly asked himself, wasn't that exactly how it was written in the game's code? Hearing these words, Larinoa jumped up and shouted that humans were actually much worse. Her face flushed with indignation. Sonata shrugged slightly and muttered awkwardly, cursing under his breath that it was awkward when she could hear his voice too. Schneasel, sitting next to him, shot Sonata a disapproving look. He thought to himself that Sonata should just shut up already. But out loud, he said that he hadn't actually decided yet whether he would help the demi-humans or not. First, he wanted to meet her kind, and then he would assess the situation for himself. After a while, the carriage arrived at the village. Everyone got out. Sonata stopped next to Schneasel and muttered that this was the very village they were looking for. Two lizard men immediately appeared before them. One of them shouted furiously, "How could they trust humans?" The second nodded in agreement and also shouted, addressing Larinoa and asking if she had any idea what he'd had to go through because of humans. Larinoa clenched her fists and shouted back furiously that these two were different. They had saved her, and besides, the man behind her was the bearer of the dark attribute from the prophecy. Then the first guard spoke up again, saying that this guy was the son of the house from which the princess had been kidnapped. He suggested that perhaps he wanted to worm his way into their trust and then kill them all from the inside. The second guard nodded in agreement, cursing that exactly. People absolutely could not be trusted. Listening to all this bickering, Schneasel furrowed his brow slightly. In a completely indifferent tone, he said that if they wanted him to leave, he would leave. Hearing these words, Larinoa jumped up, turned to him, and sincerely apologized. Her tribesmen had been rude, and she would definitely talk to them, so she asked him to wait a moment. The lizard men exchanged glances. Then Schneasel looked ahead with a frown and whispered that it didn't seem like this girl would be able to convince them. He took a few steps forward and thought to himself that they despised him simply because he was human, simply because he possessed a dark attribute. In essence, it was no different. He remembered his so-called family, who, upon learning that he possessed a dark attribute, immediately disowned him and cast him out. Just then, an old man appeared from the side. He gradually approached the arguing group. Upon seeing him, Larinoa exclaimed that he was the village elder. The old man stepped closer to the princess and noted that she had returned safely. Then he turned to the people behind her and said he was grateful to them for bringing the princess back. Just then, two lizardman guards ran up to him. They exclaimed that this was all part of the human scheme. Larinoa had surely just been tricked. The old man frowned slightly as he looked at them. He rolled his eyes and said quite calmly that the princess herself was asking these people for help. And that meant, first and foremost, they all had to believe their princess's words. Silence reigned for a couple of seconds. The elder and Schneasel exchanged glances. Then the old man smiled, and he nodded, asking everyone to come in. A little while later, the protagonist, along with his mentor and a few other half-humans, found themselves in the forest. They could hear the birds singing and children running around. The uninformed demi-humans began murmuring among themselves. Could this really be a human? And they said that a human couldn't just come in here. And they wondered, then who was this anyway? Suddenly, another girl spoke up, saying that the food was ready. Everyone started exclaiming that it smelled delicious and appetizing. Schneasel and Sonata watched what was happening with mild surprise. Then they looked to the side and saw some children playing. One of them was wearing a mask and shouting that he was the executioner. Two girls were running in front of him, laughing and shouting that if he caught them, he would definitely eat them. The second one laughed and said they had to run. Watching all this, Schneasel raised an eyebrow slightly and remarked that they seemed to be having fun here. Lizardman, nodded, and said that this was a place of rest. Just then, Sanada swam up to the protagonist and said that he hadn't actually programmed for demi-humans to live like this. Schneizel gave him a disapproving look, furrowed his brow, and said that for a man who acts like an expert with complete knowledge of the world, he was a damn useless old man. As usual, Sanada ignored the taunt. Trying not to pay attention to the now familiar remarks, he asked where Laranoa was now. Schneizel shrugged and said that the girl had mentioned she hadn't been home in a long time and had gone straight to her room. Suddenly, Sanada became lost in his thoughts. He was thinking about how this world was too different from the game settings. Then, perhaps, he would be able to free his ward from this ominous future. Behind them, there was a crunch of grass. An elf girl approached them and asked, "So, are you the savior?" She was dressed in white, looked very friendly, and had a gentle smile on her lips. The guy turned to her and snapped, "Who are you?" And then he shouted furiously that he wasn't any savior, that Laranoa had just made it all up. The ghost of Sanada appeared behind his shoulder. The old man grumbled that his charge managed to get into a fight with everyone even in such a peaceful, pastoral atmosphere. But the elf paid no attention to the outburst. She narrowed her eyes slightly and said that it seemed Laranoa hadn't lied. He really was quite a sharp-tongued man. Then she smiled brightly, tilting her head slightly to one side, and said she would like to thank her savior. Schneizel frowned slightly and asked again, reminding him that he was, in fact, a human. The girl in front of him shrugged and asked, "So what?" After all, he had saved her best friend, and things were already terrible for them. Elmia had disappeared, and then Laranoa had been kidnapped, so everything had finally turned into chaos. Hearing the new name, the protagonist asked again, "Who is that?" The girl smiled and said it was Laranoa's younger sister. Then the girl abruptly raised her hand, ordering everyone to gather. Everyone present immediately looked at her. The lizard men, the elves, and the demi-humans. Someone younger began to whisper, "So, is this blonde-haired guy actually a human? That's really scary." The elven girl continued to speak loudly and firmly, saying that this man had saved Princess Laranoa and that he wasn't scary. At these words, Schneizel blushed slightly and looked very surprised. He clearly hadn't expected such a defense. The girl continued, saying that everyone present should thank him. Silence fell for a few seconds. Everyone looked at each other in confusion. Then suddenly, a very little elven girl said, "Oh, I see," and thanked him for saving Lady Laranoa. Behind her stood a lizard man, who exchanged a glance with his demi-human friend and muttered that it seemed there were normal people among humans after all. Schneizel watched the scene unfolding before him with unease. But he remained silent. Schneizel was already grinning widely, smugly, and without the slightest embarrassment. Sanada, behind him, looked at his charge with undisguised displeasure, knowing that no one but Schneizel himself could see him anyway. Later that same night, they found themselves in a small cottage on the edge of the village. One of the lizard men led them here with a brief bow, saying that the fair-haired gentleman would be spending the night here tonight. The door slammed shut behind him. Schneizel glanced sideways and said with a slight sneer, "Did Sanada really think they were cruel?" They were far purer of heart than the people from the world he had seen. Sanada swam closer, nodded, and quietly agreed that they really weren't behaving at all as he'd expected. But he immediately added that the enmity between humans and demi-humans in this world ran too deep, so Schneizel shouldn't let his guard down. The protagonist shot him a disgruntled glance, frowned, and curtly retorted that he believed only what he saw with his own eyes. They weren't given a chance to finish their conversation. Somewhere in the darkness of the village, a bell rang loudly and alarmingly, once, then again, without stopping. They ran outside. Chaos reigned all around. Screams rang out from every direction. Torches flickered in the darkness, and amid the general din, words came through clearly. Attack, slave traders from the church. Schneizel and Sanada froze on the porch, exchanging surprised glances. When Sanada looked around, he recognized the people in armor. They were knights of the church. 3 of them had already approached the girl, Laranoa's best friend, whom Schneizel had seen earlier that day. They threw her to the ground. She screamed and tried to break free. One of the knights held his weapon out in front of him and demanded that she immediately remove the magic stone, since it could fetch a huge sum of money. The elf on the ground fought back furiously and screamed that she would never do it. The knights exchanged glances and burst out laughing, realizing that she was quite the catch in her own right, and that they could make use of her themselves before selling her. The next second, they ripped her dress off. The girl screamed, begging them to stop and calling out for help. A lizard man ran out from behind one of the houses. He rushed in between them and shoved the knight aside, and he shouted for them to stop. The knight ordered him to shut up in response, and he lunged at the lizard man, starting a fight. Sanada stood on the porch, still bewildered, and muttered that he didn't understand why the knights of the church were acting this way. And then the ground shook. Huge roots begin bursting out of the soil with a deafening crash. They tore through the earth from below, scattering stones and dirt in all directions, and in the next second pierced the knights right through, lifting them into the air. In the silence of the night, a girl's voice rang out, calm and somber, without a single unnecessary inflection. Laranoa said that they had their long-awaited reunion, and they had already been interrupted. In a matter of seconds, a huge world tree grew behind her. Sanada shouted her name and said that was exactly how they should act. Schneizel glanced at him in surprise and asked again, "Is this normal? People are being killed out there." Sanada looked at his protege, recalling everything he himself had said about this before, and he muttered dryly that these people were clearly not the ones he'd been talking about. Behind Laranoa, more and more figures began to emerge from the darkness, demi-humans and lizard men, running out of houses and alleys, their voices filled with undisguised relief. The princess had finally arrived. She would resolve everything. Laranoa turned to her people and shouted sharply for everyone to retreat. She would hold them off here herself. And then a sword flashed through the air, and all the roots holding the knights in place were severed in a single stroke. Everyone stared in surprise at the one who had done it. A silhouette slowly emerged from the shadows, an elven girl with a sword in her hand. Schneizel and Sanada exchanged glances. Sanada cautiously asked, "What on earth is this?" The elven girl continued to slowly emerge from the shadows, and with every step, her features became clearer. She turned to Laranoa and asked with a hint of contempt, "Did you really think you could defeat all of us with such pitiful strength? So this is the demi-human's trump card?" Laughter. Laranoa froze in place. Something in that voice made her fall silent mid-sentence. She stared at the face that was gradually emerging from the darkness. And slowly, bewildered, she whispered a name. Elmia. The adult elf held her sword out in front of her, a cold smirk playing on her lips, and she was completely ready to attack. A little earlier, the flower-filled clearing at the edge of the forest was quiet and bathed in light. Two young elven girls, two sisters, were sitting in this clearing. One held a wreath of flowers in her hands and sat with her back straight, like a queen, but her face was unhappy. She muttered quietly but firmly that she didn't want to be a princess and wasn't cut out for it all. Across from her, the second girl clenched her hands into fists and shouted enthusiastically that everything would work out. Her little sister was bound to succeed, and she herself would always support her. Elmia sat with her legs crossed and reluctantly explained that she was just really bad at magic. Then she paused for a second, and then she jumped up suddenly, spread her arms wide, and shouted that in that case she would master the sword and become a knight for her sister. Laranoa looked at her in confusion. Then she lowered her head in embarrassment, and then she carefully held out a sheet of paper with a dried flower to her sister and asked her to take it. Elmia froze, holding this small, fragile thing in her hands, and she muttered in surprise, "This flower that my sister keeps so carefully. Can I really take it?" Laranoa nodded. Then she took the wreath from her lap and moved closer, and she said that this was a sign that Elmia would be her knight. Laranoa snapped out of her memory abruptly, as if surfacing after a long dive. She stood in the middle of the village at night, with demi-humans crowding behind her, Sanada and Schneizel by her side. And right in front of her stood her sister, Elmia. Only she looked much older, and carried herself quite differently than in that childhood memory. Surrounded by church soldiers, a blade in her hand, a cold smirk on her face. Laranoa slowly sank to the ground and whispered her name, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and pain. Elmia frowned in displeasure. She made a sharp lunge with her sword toward her, and snapped that she found it extremely unpleasant when some demi-human dared to call her by name. Laranoa threw her head back and cried out. Didn't she recognize her? Schneizel and Sanada watched the scene in silence, looking bewildered. The remaining knights, standing behind the demi-humans, began shouting something about the status of a lady of the Holy Sword, claiming that the lord of the palace himself had recognized her, even if she was a demi-human. Sanada frowned and muttered under his breath that Laranoa's plant magic had no effect on them, and that was very strange. It shouldn't be that way. One of the soldiers, as if having overheard him, explained with a smirk that they were protected by the Creator's blessing, and the demi-humans' magic simply didn't work on them. After these words, a brief, heavy silence fell. Schneizel slowly lowered his head, and then, very calmly, almost quietly, he asked, "What about his attack?" The next second, he was already moving. The first blow knocked the knight off his feet with such force that he crashed into the two standing nearby. They fell after him, their armor clattering to the ground. Laranoa turned to him and said quietly, "Mr. Savior." Elmia gripped her blade tighter and snapped, "Who is he?" Schneizel paid no attention to the question. He stepped forward and casually remarked that he didn't understand why she was bothering with them. They were pathetic weaklings, far weaker than executioners. Sanada, standing off to the side, began to mutter quietly that this was strange. Now the defense had suddenly stopped working entirely, as if it had never existed. Something was wrong here. Meanwhile, Laranoa tried to say something to Schneasel about how he had come to save her, yet in the moment of danger hadn't even looked in her direction. Schneasel shot her a disgruntled glance, and replied that they were just getting in the way. Then he sighed heavily, shielded her with his body, and asked, "Who is this woman?" Laranoa exclaimed excitedly that she was her younger sister. Schneasel glanced at her in confusion, and muttered that the sister clearly looked older. Could it really be that the person standing before him was just a scrawny runt? Laranoa exclaimed indignantly that this wasn't the case. Then, softening her tone slightly, she added that Elmia used to have almost the same figure as her, but now everything was different. Schneasel shrugged and asked if she meant to say that her younger sister had suddenly shot up. Laranoa shrugged in response and muttered dejectedly that she couldn't really explain it. Sanada immediately flew over to her and stared intently, clearly trying to figure it out. Laranoa immediately shouted furiously at him not to stare at the girl's body. Sanada mumbled sheepishly that this was quite a difference in treatment. Elmia didn't wait for their argument to end. She drew her sword and swung it, and in the next second, with a single motion, she sliced through the shadows in front of her. Schneasel took a slight step to the side and muttered with interest. "So that's how it is, then. This woman is capable of cutting through his shadows." Elmia leaped high, raised her blade, and shouted a battle cry. Let him become rust on her blade. Schneasel stepped aside, dodging the blow. Laranoa screamed, begging her sister to stop. Sanada called out his ward's name anxiously. Then he flew closer and whispered something quickly into his ear. Schneasel smiled slightly. The next moment, he waved his hand, and shadows descended upon Elmia from all sides at once, enveloping her movements. Elmia frantically tried to cut through them, but for every thread her sword severed, 3 new ones immediately appeared in its place, thicker and denser than before. She cried out, "What's happening?" And she kept fighting, but her strength was draining away with every passing second. Schneasel glanced at Sanada with a smile and remarked that the shadows were breaking down into threads on their own. And it turned out this guy actually did say something useful sometimes. So be it, he'd give him some credit. Sanada soared a little higher and waved his arms with undisguised pride. Though he admitted that, to be honest, he hadn't been sure the guy would pull it off, but that was to be expected from the shadow boss. Schneasel looked at Elmia again, entangled in shadows, and thought that if he left her as she was, there would be too many problems. He was already ready to act when Laranoa suddenly jumped in front of him. She spread her arms wide, shielding her sister with her own body, and asked the gentleman's savior not to touch her. She said that Elmia was actually very kind and must have her own reasons for doing this. And then she cried out that if they were determined to kill this girl anyway, then they should kill her instead. Schneasel froze. He stared long and intently at the girl in front of him. Then he muttered quite calmly that so this was how an older sister protected her younger sister. At least they're better than his own family. Laranoa froze in confusion, trying to figure out what he was talking about. Sanada flew closer and silently looked at the boy with undisguised sympathy. Schneasel shook his head, coming to his senses, and raised his hand, declaring that, for starters, he would tie Elmia up after all. Dark threads wrapped more tightly around the girl and gently lowered her to the ground, restraining her movements. The surviving knights of the church exchanged bewildered glances and began to murmur that this couldn't be true. The Holy Swordswoman had been defeated in an instant. This was surely a minion of the evil god, and punishment would surely befall him. Schneasel stood with his back to them. He slowly turned his head, paused for a second, and very quietly, but with such a threat in his voice that the knights involuntarily stepped back, he said that he didn't know what they had done to this girl, but they would be the ones to pay the price. He smoothed his hair with his hand. One eye darkened, slowly, like a fire dying out, and darkness surged outward in a broad wave, engulfing everything around it. The moon in the sky continued to shine, but its light no longer reached the earth. When the darkness receded, all the knights were dead. No screams, no sound, just silence. A short while later, in the main house of the village where Laranoa lived, Elmia lay bound on the bed. Her older sister knelt nearby, her fists clenched tightly on the bedspread, and she quietly uttered her name, thinking about how who could have imagined that their meeting would turn out exactly like this. Sanada and Schneasel exchanged bewildered glances and watched the two sisters in silence. Then Schneasel asked quietly, "Do they really not understand what happened?" Sanada paused, and then he explained that there was some kind of discrepancy in the combat abilities of Elmia and the knights. This very creator they were talking about. Perhaps he is capable of reshaping others' abilities as he sees fit. Schneasel frowned slightly and asked, "So the creator can enhance abilities as much as he wants?" Sanada shook his head, recalling the image of the defeated soldiers, and said that there must surely be a limit, which was precisely why the Holy Knights had been so weak against his magic. Noticing the puzzled look on Schniezel's face, Sanada continued to explain, let's say that the total value of a single person's abilities is always constant. Let's say this person has an attack of 3 and a defense of 2. If you increase their attack, you can reduce their defense to 0 and raise their attack to 5. Schniezel snorted, clearly not fully understanding. Sanada continued, saying that the creator had increased Elmia's resistance to demi-human attacks. In exchange, he likely reduced her resistance to all other attacks. He thought to himself that this was just like adjusting a character's stats in a game. And then it dawned on him, this is stat allocation. This is the logic of game settings. So this so-called creator. Sanada's eyes widened, and he was about to voice his thought. But Schniezel cut him off, asking what was wrong with him. There was movement on the bed. Elmia groaned, tried to move her hands, then mumbled something about demi-humans, that they needed to be destroyed, every last one of them. And suddenly she woke up with a start, jumping up from the bed. Laranoa and Schniezel immediately stood before her. Elmia thrashed about, trying to break free from the shadowy bonds, and screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to be released immediately. Laranoa called out her name, and suddenly saw it. A sheet of paper with a dried flower fell from her sister's hands, the very one she had given her long ago in that sunny clearing. Laranoa froze in confusion, and the words of little Elmia floated into her mind, that she would definitely become her knight. She took a few steps forward, pressed her hands to her chest, and whispered that this was the very bookmark, the one she had kept with her all this time. The next second, Elmia saw it. Her eyes widened, and immediately, rage overwhelmed everything else. She raised her foot and brought her heel down hard on the bookmark, stomping it right into the floor. Laranoa froze in place. Elmia stood with her lips tightly pressed together, glaring furiously at everyone present as she continued to press her heel down on the dried flower. Schniezel and Sanada watched the scene in silence. Laranoa slowly sank to the floor. Her face darkened. Her gaze went blank. Schniezel raised his eyebrows in surprise. Then he narrowed his eyes. He turned to Sanada and asked if there was any way to bring this girl back to her normal state. Sanada shook his head and said that there was one person who might be able to solve such a problem. Schniezel turned sharply toward him, frowned, and asked, "Who?" Sanada nodded to himself and replied briefly, "The saint." Meanwhile, on the other side of the kingdom, where the large castle temple stood, the place where the saint had been raised, it was quiet and sunny. A wide river flowed slowly between the rocks, and a young girl was hopping across them. With a light, almost dancing gait, her arms spread out to the sides for balance. Behind her on the bank stood a knight in armor, watching her absently. Then he called out and asked where she was going. The girl literally hopped onto the nearest rock, turned to him with a bright, almost childlike smile, and first muttered something under her breath, then added more loudly that she had a feeling she had to go in that very direction. The knight asked, bewildered, "Where exactly?" The girl folded her hands in front of her, still smiling, and explained that the world was the most important thing to her. Then her smile faded slightly, and her expression grew serious. She quietly added that the source of the disturbance must be eliminated. The forest was dense and quiet. The path they were walking on was barely visible, more like trampled grass than a real road. Laranoa walked ahead, pointing the way. She waved her hand toward the thick undergrowth, and she explained that medicinal herbs must grow somewhere around here. With their help, they would be able to treat the wounds of all the injured in the village. Sanada smirked as he looked at his charge and remarked that Schniezel, it turned out, had his good points. He was even helping to look for herbs. Schniezel paid no attention to this dig. He silently knelt down near one of the bushes and said that he was simply tired of sitting cooped up in the village. Sanada looked at him with a slight smile. Schniezel sensed the gaze, turned around, and asked irritably, "What's wrong?" Sanada threw his hands behind his head and replied casually that everything was fine. Then someone asked about Elmia. Schniezel explained that she was lying in bed. Sanada mentally pieced together the picture, a girl shrouded in shadows, unable to move, and asked doubtfully, "And you call that just lying down?" Then, watching his ward and Laranoa methodically gather herbs, he thought that ordinary herbs wouldn't bring Elmia's sanity back anyway. Suddenly, a loud scream rang out from deep within the forest. Schniezel instantly leapt forward, shielding the girl and the ghost, and shouted impatiently, hoping no one would say it was the church knights again. The scream repeated, and then came the roar of a beast. A massive bare wild boar burst out of the thicket, a creature that seemed to be made of nothing but sheer weight and fury. It was approaching the girl, who was sitting on the ground by a tree, pulling her cloak tight and covering herself with her arms, clearly unsure of what to do or where to run. The three of them rushed in that direction. Larinoa suddenly froze halfway there and muttered tensely, "Could it be a human?" She was terrified. The next second, the beast swung its massive paw, aiming at the girl, and Schneasel snapped his fingers. The shadows sprang into action instantly, like a released bowstring. They crashed into the beast's carcass from all sides at once, piercing it through with dark threads. The bare wild boar didn't even have time to make a sound. The girl remained sitting by the tree, staring ahead with wide eyes, clearly not understanding what had just happened. The trio stepped closer. Schneasel stepped slightly forward and looked silently at the girl. She suddenly came to her senses, jumped to her feet, and began to thank everyone present profusely. After all, they had saved her. Then she ran even closer and thanked them again, now with undisguised enthusiasm. Schneasel, noticing that Larinoa was standing behind him, terrified, trembling, unable to bring herself to move. He unobtrusively shielded her with his body and turned to the rescued girl, asking who she was and what she was doing in such a place. The girl introduced herself. Riel, an ordinary adventurer. Schneasel continued. What on earth was an adventurer doing in such a remote forest? Riel explained that she had been dragged to the church by force, but she'd had enough, so she'd run away. As Sonata rushed past her, he thought to himself, so they were kidnapped from the church. Ignoring their wary glances, Riel continued and asked if they could hide her in the village. Schneasel and Sonata exchanged surprised glances. Larinoa shuddered, and she exclaimed, "Hide a human in the lands of the demi-humans?" And then she burst out, "Those damned humans, after everything they've done, still have the nerve to ask for help." Riel cut her off. She calmly pointed at Schneasel and said that this man was a human too, which meant that humans and demi-humans could certainly coexist. Larinoa stopped mid-sentence and fell silent, clearly realizing she was losing the argument. Riel continued, speaking more gently now, saying that she knew and understood that a lot had happened between humans and demi-humans. But personally, it would be very helpful to her if they helped, that's all. She had no intention of staying for good. Larinoa lowered her head and asked gloomily, wasn't she afraid of the demi-humans? Riel froze in confusion, her eyes wide, and then it seemed to dawn on her. She whispered, "Isn't it you who's afraid of people?" Larinoa recoiled in horror. Riel immediately stepped toward her, clasped her hands tightly in hers, and asked hurriedly, they hadn't done anything to her, had they? The dark elf froze in place, not knowing how to react. Then Riel continued, they'd only just met, and hadn't really even talked yet. So, for example, they could very well become friends. With that, she squeezed Larinoa's hands even tighter and looked at her with genuine enthusiasm. Schneasel sighed heavily and muttered that she really was a reckless woman. Schneasel took a few steps forward, stopped near Larinoa, and calmly stated that it was entirely up to her, whether to accept this adventuress or not. Larinoa clenched her hands into fists and silently considered her answer. And then she said quietly but firmly, they had been attacked by people. Right now, she and her companion were gathering medicinal herbs, and if the girl was willing to help, then, of course, they would accept her. As soon as Riel finished speaking, she immediately jumped toward her, wrapped her arms tightly around her shoulders, and squinted with delight. She thanked her sincerely several times without letting go. Larinoa, stumbling, tried to break free and muttered that it was too close. Riel took a step back, but wasn't the least bit embarrassed and added that in gratitude she would take care of dinner, and that her cooking wasn't exactly easy to come by, and asked if they knew that. Schneasel narrowed his eyes and asked grumpily, where's that condescending tone coming from? Then he shrugged and muttered that he didn't care and she could do whatever she wanted. A friendly silence reigned for a while. Riel carefully chopped vegetables, sifting through ingredients and adding others, working at the pot with undisguised enthusiasm. The smell rising from the fire was, to put it mildly, alarming. When everything was ready, she waved her hand and invited everyone to help themselves. Her signature soup made from just about anything. Bones with skulls, clearly poisonous mushrooms, and something else that was hard to name were floating in the pot. The trio exchanged glances and pursed their lips in unison. Larinoa turned pale and muttered that it looked very unusual, and added to herself that even if this was ordinary human food, not touching what was served would be extremely rude. Sonata, realizing with undisguised relief that he wasn't obligated to eat in his spirit form, thought to himself, so that's what it's not that simple to try mint. Schneasel, the most desperate of them all, picked up a spoon and scooped up a little. He sniffed it carefully, looked at it, and tasted it. The next second, he jumped up, thrust his hand forward, and shouted that this adventuress was a real killer. Riel, sitting on the other side of the fire, picked up a spoon and a plate and calmly said there was no need to be so dramatic. Then she hesitated, smiled sheepishly, and asked, is it really that bad? Then she scooped up a spoonful herself and tasted it. and immediately groaned, clutching her stomach. Larinoa immediately jumped up to her and, stumbling over her words as she tried to overcome her own fear, asked if she was all right. A little while later, when they had finished eating, all four set off back toward the village. Riel walked slightly behind, whining incessantly and saying she was going to die. She was visibly staggering. Schneizel, walking at the front of the group, muttered, well, they exposed her as a murderer, and she's decided to kill herself. Just a fool. Sanada flew alongside, glancing back and forth between the group members in confusion, mentally noting that with a personality like that, Riel was most likely a named character. Suddenly, the girl calmed down and walked a few meters in silence. Then she turned to Schneizel and asked, "Why does a human help demi-humans?" Schneizel, without turning around, replied that for him, there was no difference between humans and demi-humans. He believed only in those he chose to believe in. That was all, without any reason. Larinoa clenched her fist beside her and said that was exactly it. Her savior judged with an unclouded gaze. Riel turned to her and said quietly, "So that's how it is." Then Larinoa, not noticing the pause, asked, "An adventurer herself, one might say. She had betrayed the church, which meant that the ugly essence of this place had burned her too." Riel merely repeated the last words slowly and said nothing in reply. They walked in silence for a while. Then a soft rustle from the bushes made Larinoa jerk her head up. A dark spot loomed ahead on the ground. She ran closer, and she cried out. It was Risak the lizard man. She knelt down beside him. The others followed her. The boy was lying on the ground, dark blood soaking through the fabric on his shoulder. Schneizel stood up, straightened, and asked, "Wasn't this the child from her village?" Larinoa didn't answer. She frantically asked why he was here, glancing around in panic. Risak, clutching his wounded arm tightly, struggled to explain that his father's condition had worsened. He'd gone to look for herbs, and then suddenly, an arrow. At these words, all four jumped to their feet and stood on all four sides of the wounded man, looking around frantically. Risak called the princess by name and whispered that his vision was growing dark. He could hardly see anything. Schneizel turned to him, furrowed his brow slightly, and said that it was a poisoned arrow. Then he asked if they had any herbs or medicine capable of counteracting the poison. Larinoa shook her head and replied in a trembling voice that she only had herbs for healing wounds, nothing more. The next moment, Riel spoke up. She ordered everyone to step back, and a scepter appeared in her hands out of nowhere. She waved her arms several times and threw back her hood, and she began to cast a spell. Everyone watched intently. Then there was a bright flash. Larinoa closed her eyes. Schneizel looked on in confusion, shielding his eyes with his hand. Risak got up from the ground. He rubbed his eyes with his hands and muttered that he could see, and nothing hurt. The wounds had disappeared. Larinoa immediately jumped over to him and began feeling him over, checking to see if everything was really okay. Riel stood with her hands in front of her, smiling warmly and chuckling slightly, then said that she had actually only mastered basic healing magic. Larinoa immediately jumped up and exclaimed fiercely that completely removing the poison was far beyond the level of basic magic. It was astonishing. Riel stepped back slightly and asked with a smile if the elf now had a better opinion of her. Larinoa sat down on the ground and, stumbling slightly over her words, muttered that nothing of the sort. Risak jumped to his feet and said with genuine astonishment that a human had saved him. Riel waved at him and nodded with a smile. Sanada and Schneizel remained standing slightly to the side. Sanada muttered under his breath, "The food is deadly, but the healing magic is overwhelming." He was almost certain who was standing before them. Schneizel glanced sideways at his mentor and asked quietly, "Who is she?" Sanada paused for a second, then said that she was the only person capable of removing the brainwashing from Elmia. And he added heavily, looking away, "Besides, according to the game's plot, Schneizel is supposed to kill her." Schneizel frowned and jerked his head up. At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed from the forest. Everyone immediately assumed defensive stances. Larinoa stepped forward, shielding her people, and she shouted that it was people again. Could it be that they were the ones who had wounded the child? And now they had come to track down Riel? Hearing this, Riel's face darkened slightly, and she lowered her eyes. Then Schneizel spoke up, calmly and coldly. He stated that that wasn't the case at all. He turned to the new member of their squad and said that she was the one in command of all these people. Larinoa froze in confusion. Then her eyes widened as she realized what was happening. Schneizel frowned and added that the show was over, and asked tensely, "What is your goal?" The girl in front of him took off her cloak and removed her glasses. It was Saint Ariel. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.